All right, so get this. We're diving into the Black Death today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the plague that just wiped out a huge chunk of Europe in the 1300s.
Yeah.
And, you probably think you know the story, right? Like it just kind of showed up out of nowhere.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, hold on, because there's this new research that's suggesting something completely different.
Really?
We've got excerpts from this SciTech Daily article about it, and it's wild.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Okay, so basically the Black Death might have actually been around for like a century before it really blew up.
Like a secret history of the plague?
Exactly, like a secret history, and we're going to try to unpack it all today.
A secret history. I always thought the Black Death just kind of appeared in Europe around 1346.
Yeah, that's what we've always been told, right?
Yeah, like a sudden outbreak.
But these historians, Monica Green and Nahyan Fancy,
Okay.
they've been digging through all these primary sources like chronicles and medical texts.
Wow, so like first-hand accounts.
Exactly, and they're finding clues that suggest the plague was already in the Middle East way back in the 1250s.
Wow, that's almost 100 years earlier.
I know, it's crazy, right?
But what kind of clues are we talking about? Like, do they actually describe the plague?
Oh, yeah, they do. And some of them are really detailed descriptions, too. Like they talk about these inflamed and tender swellings of the lymph nodes.
Oh, so BIBOs.
Yeah, exactly. BIBOs, which is like the classic sign of the plague.
That's fascinating. So even back then, they knew it was something different, something really bad.
It seems that way, right? And some of these accounts even used the specific Arabic term for plague, which refers to those buboes.
That's incredible. Like they had a word for it even then.
It really makes you think about what it might have been like to experience that, not knowing what was causing it, how to stop it.
Right. It must have been terrifying.
So it begs the question, right? If the plague was already around in the 1250s, why didn't it cause the same devastation then? What was different about the 14th century? Well, one theory the researchers have is that it might be connected to the Mongols.
The Mongols, like Genghis Khan and all that.
Yeah, remember they had this massive empire across Asia.
Right. Yeah, it was huge.
And in 1258, they conquered Baghdad.
Oh, yeah, Baghdad was like a major center of trade and everything, right?
Exactly, and that kind of conquest would have caused a lot of chaos, a lot of movement of people.
Which could easily spread disease.
Exactly, you've got these huge armies on the move, disrupting ecosystems, maybe even carrying infected rodents with them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
And the researchers think that might be how the plague got introduced to new areas and started spreading more widely.
It makes sense when you think about how connected the world already was back then, even without planes and trains.
Absolutely. Diseases don't really care about borders, do they?
Nope, they sure don't.
So it's fascinating to think about how people at the time tried to understand these outbreaks, because obviously they didn't have our understanding of bacteria and viruses.
Right, they believed in miasmas, that bad air.
Yeah, it seems kind of crazy to us now, but that was the main theory for a long time.
I know. But it's interesting, though, that even without microscopes, some people were really observant.
They documented the symptoms and how it seemed to spread with surprising accuracy.
Well, that brings up the idea of a prodrome period.
A prodrome?
Yeah, it's basically the stage where a disease is present, but it hasn't reached pandemic levels yet.
So like it's kind of simmering under the surface waiting to erupt.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And the researchers think that the plague might have been circulating quietly, maybe even for decades before conditions were right for it to become the Black Death that we know.
Hold on, so you're saying that the Black Death might have been lurking in the background for a century before it became a pandemic?
It's a pretty wild thought, isn't it?
It completely changes how I think about how these things happen.
It really challenges our assumptions, doesn't it?
It definitely does. And you know what? We're just getting started.
Oh, there's more.
There's so much more to unpack about this research, so stay tuned.
So the Black Death could have been simmering for decades. Wow, that really changes how I think about pandemics.
I know, right? We always think about those sudden outbreaks.
Right, like it comes out of nowhere.
But this research is pointing to like a gradual process.
Like a slow burn.
Exactly, a slow burn. And it could have been going on for almost 100 years.
That's a long time. Imagine the impact, even if it wasn't as bad as the Black Death we know.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how many other pandemics might have had similar prodrome periods. Like maybe we're just starting to understand how these things really happen.
That prodrome idea is really interesting. Can we talk more about that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think it's key to understanding this whole slow burn thing.
So a prodrome is basically that stage where a disease is present, but it's not a pandemic yet.
Okay, so it's like a spark that hasn't set the whole forest on fire.
Exactly. A great analogy. Like the plague, it's mainly a rodent disease, right?
Right.
It needs the right conditions to jump to humans, like a lot of fleas and close contact between rodents and humans.
So it's not just about the bacteria itself, it's about this whole ecological balance.
You got it. Things like climate, food sources, even human behavior can all play a role.
So we can't just focus on the bacteria. We have to look at the whole system, all these factors that could lead to a pandemic.
It's like a web right. One little change can trigger a whole chain reaction.
Which brings us back to the Mongols. It's fascinating that their conquest of Baghdad could have inadvertently set the stage for the Black Death.
Right. Like a butterfly effect almost.
Yeah, their empire was so vast they were constantly on the move.
And they might have created a path for the plague to spread without even realizing it.
It's like those trade routes weren't just carrying silk and spices, they were carrying the seeds of a pandemic.
And it shows you that globalization, even back then, had its risks. Connection is great for ideas and goods, but it also helps diseases spread.
This is where it gets really interesting. Remember we talked about the genetic link to Central Asia?
Yeah, the Black Death strain of Yersinia pestis being related to marmots in Central Asia.
Yeah. So how did it get from those steps all the way to the Middle East? It's a huge distance.
It's like a puzzle. And again, the Mongols might be the answer. Their trade networks and military campaigns went all over Eurasia, connecting those distant places.
So they could have carried infected rodents or fleas across those distances without even knowing it.
It's possible. Maybe the plague was quietly circulating in Central Asia among the marmots, and then boom, the Mongols give it a ride to new territories.
So we can't really understand a pandemic without looking at its origins, its whole journey, and all these complex factors that come into play.
And that's why this research is so important. It's not just about rewriting history, it's about understanding how pandemics work so we can be ready for the next one.
It makes you wonder what other secrets are still out there. What other hidden pandemic histories are waiting to be discovered?
It's exciting, isn't it? We think of history as settled, but there's always more to learn.
This deep dive has been incredible so far. We've found clues that the Black Death could have been lurking for decades before it hit Europe. We've looked at the Mongol connection and how they might have spread the plague from Central Asia. But the big question is still there. If the plague was already in the Middle East in the 1250s, what made it explode in the 14th century? That's the big question, right? If the plague was in the Middle East back in the 1250s, what changed in the 14th century? Why the sudden explosion?
Yeah, it's the big mystery. And like a lot of things in history, there's probably not just one simple answer. It was probably a bunch of different things that just happened to come together at the right time.
Like a perfect storm.
Exactly, like a perfect storm for a pandemic.
So what were some of those things that might have been at play?
Well, remember how we talked about the plague being mainly a rodent disease, so it needs certain conditions to jump to humans? And those conditions might not have been around all the time in the 1250s, like maybe the rodent populations went up and down, or the environment changed, which affected the fleas.
Right, because the fleas are the ones spreading the bacteria.
Exactly. It's all about that balance. Things like temperature and rainfall, even what kinds of crops people were growing could have affected the rodents and the fleas.
So it's like these tiny little changes could have created the perfect opportunity for the plague to spread.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the human side of things, too. Trade patterns, sanitation practices, even something as simple as how people stored their grain could have played a role.
It's kind of amazing how all these different factors could come together to create one of the deadliest pandemics in history.
It really is. It shows how complex disease outbreaks are and how we need to look at the whole picture. Not just the bacteria, but the environment, human behavior, everything.
This whole deep dive has really changed how I think about pandemics. I used to think of them as these isolated events, but now I see it more like a process that unfolds over time.
Yeah, and sometimes those processes have a really long history, like the Black Death might have been developing and changing for decades before it really hit.
It's almost like we need to become detectives looking for those early warning signs.
Exactly, looking for the clues in historical records, medical texts, even genetic data. It's all connected.
So what can we learn from the Black Death's secret history? What can it teach us about facing future pandemics?
Well, one thing is that we need to be on the lookout all the time. Even if something seems small or unimportant, it could be a sign of something bigger.
Like a canary in a coal mine.
Exactly. We also need to really understand those ecological factors that can contribute to outbreaks, like climate change and deforestation.
It's like we can't just focus on treating diseases after they appear. We need to be proactive and try to prevent them in the first place.
That's a really important point. It's about understanding that human health is tied to the health of the planet.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. We've learned that the Black Death might have had a much longer history than we thought.
It's amazing what we can learn from looking back at the past.
And maybe a little bit scary, too, knowing how these pandemics can develop over time.
Yeah, it's a reminder to stay curious and to keep learning. There's always something new to discover.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Black Death's secret history. We've covered a lot of ground, but I hope this has given you something to think about. Remember, history might have some secrets, but by studying the past, we can be better prepared for the future.
Well said. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop learning.